Hello and welcome to Padre's Corner. This is a show where we put you into the mind of a Jesuit priest and see if you come out sane on the other side. I'm Father Robert Balacer, the digital Jesuit, coming to you from my almost open, semi-open from quarantine community in the Vatican. That's in Rome, Italy. Now, folks, we have something going on tomorrow, and I'm going to need some of your thoughts and prayers, even if you don't believe that, and that is we're going to try to lift, at least slightly, in a limited fashion, some of the quarantine. We're actually inviting some of our lay staff to come back into the Curia so that they can get back to work. We've actually been paying them the entire time, the entire 2 months that we've been locked down, but some of them would like to get into the office. So we're going to be trying doing a Monday, Wednesday, Friday thing, where they'll come in. We're going to have some extreme distancing protocols about how we interact, or rather how we don't interact with one another. And we're going to see what happens. I'm hoping for the best. We're preparing for the worst. We're preparing to re-lock down the community. But at some point, we're all going to have to start looking at this, looking at reopening ourselves to the world. And, well, it might as well start with our community. Now, let's shy away from COVID. Let's shy away from the coronavirus because we're all being affected by it. And instead, let's talk about something a bit more cheery, something that I think you can agree can lift our spirits. I want to talk a little bit about nuclear meltdowns. Now, specifically, I want to talk about the nuclear meltdown at Chernobyl. We all have heard about Chernobyl, some of us just because of that wonderful, wonderful, incredibly well done movie, dramatization by HBO. But for my generation, we actually lived through it. Chernobyl isn't just a footnote. Chernobyl isn't just really good drama on HBO. Chernobyl was an event that we had to experience firsthand. And it was something that put the fear of nuclear power into us, even if 3 Mile Island hadn't done it years before. Now, today, April 26th, is the 34th anniversary of the meltdown at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. It's when it suffered a catastrophic LOCA. That's a loss of cooling accident. Now, we could just talk about the HBO special. We could talk about the people behind it. We could talk about the drama. We could talk about some of the political intrigue that led up to it. But because this is Padre's Corner, and because we are geeks, I want to geek out. I want to get into the minutia. I want to do the same sort of breakdown that we did for the Apollo 13 accident. Show you where things went wrong. Like most disasters, it was a chain. And so many things had to go wrong in order for that chain to get pulled and the disaster to finally become a reality. So let's get at it. Now, to understand the accident, you first have to understand the design of a reactor in the Soviet Union. The Chernobyl nuclear power station used what was called a graphite moderated high power channel reactor, also known as an RBMK. That's actually probably a name that you heard from the HBO movie. Now, there are two things that made Soviet-era reactors unique from the ones at the time that were in the West. The first is that they used graphite as a neutron moderator, and the second is that they have a positive void coefficient. Now, let's take those one at a time because they're related, but they're very, very important. The first is neutron moderation. Now, what is neutron moderation, and why did Chernobyl use graphite while the United States and the other Western countries didn't? Well, here's a fun fact about nuclear fission reactors. As you split the atom of uranium-235, which is the most commonly used fuel, it releases energy, a lot of energy, in the form of heat, two lighter elements, that's Kr92 and Ba141, and 3 free neutrons. Now, these 3 free neutrons just shoot off in different directions, and then they can be absorbed by additional U-235 atoms, which will continue the reaction, the chain reaction. Now, it sounds simple. But in practice, it's actually really difficult. Even in something as dense as a fissile pile of U-235, it's some of the most dense material on the face of the planet. Because on the atomic level, even though it's so heavy, even though it's so dense, even though there's so much mass packed into so little space, the atoms are actually really spaced far apart. So you need a moderator. You need something to slow those neutrons down, to reflect them around a little bit, to give them the best chance to find another atom of U-235. Now, in a light water reactor, like we use in the West, that moderator is water. It bounces off of H2O molecules, imparts a little bit of energy. Sometimes you have H2O broken apart, and eventually it will find a U-235. But inside of an RBMK reactor in the Soviet Union, and even now, they use graphite. Now, why would they use graphite? Well, the reason why they used a graphite moderated reactor is that they could use natural uranium instead of enriched U-235 as fuel. Imagine this. Imagine you had a car and you had two choices for the engine. One engine required high octane fuel. That's very, very processed. It has to go to a cracker, which will break apart the crude layers, and then you'd have to refine it further in order to get the fuel that you need for that engine. It's very, very energy intensive. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of equipment. Or you could get an engine that you could take crude, almost straight out of the ground, dump it into the tank, and run. Now, obviously, there's going to be pros and cons to each engine, but both of them are definitely approaches to getting the same thing, the same amount of energy out of your engine. Now, in the former Soviet Union, they used graphite because it was the nuclear equivalent of being able to use crude in their car. They used a graphite moderated reactor so that they didn't have to enrich the uranium. We enrich uranium, enrich U-235 as fuel. And that's a very costly and a very time-consuming step. It basically means centrifuging minuscule amounts of uranium-235 in really expensive pieces of precision equipment to separate out the even smaller amounts of pure material in the form of vapor, depositing it on the end of a drum, and then doing that over and over and over again. Not tens of dozens of hundreds, maybe thousands of times across multiple machines in order to get enough fertile, pure U-235 to work in a water-moderated reactor. But in the Soviet Union, they didn't want to do that. In the Soviet Union, they saw that as an unnecessary step. In the Soviet Union, they said, wait a minute, why are you making your car use that engine that is so limited where you could make something that uses this engine? And this engine, this graphite moderated reactor can use uranium almost straight out of the ground. Why wouldn't you do that? And actually, that makes kind of sense. If you are building a very large reactor, if you're building something that you can just throw a lot of material into, a huge reactor, then maybe you think you don't need something precision. It's like the old adage of the United States versus the Soviet Union going into space. The United States spent millions of dollars to try to find a way to make a pen work in space without making a mess. Having a ink reservoir that's pressurized so that it would force the ink towards the nib, or having a special sort of ball so that the ink would be evenly spaced on the paper. They spent timeless hours and days and weeks and years of man time in order to make that thing work. The Soviets used a pencil. This was the same sort of thing. It was the Soviets saying, look, the West always overthinks it. We've got the same thing, except we've got bigger reactors. And bigger reactors they were. In fact, the Soviet Union could build much larger reactors than any of those that we could build in the West. Some of the largest nuclear reactors, even today, are in the former Soviet Union. Something like the 1,500 megawatt units that are in Lithuania. Also, continuing on the build it bigger and cheaper model, Soviet-era reactors were without containment vessels and were essentially huge pits in the ground surrounded by layers of concrete, sand, and steel, with biological shields, these huge 1,000-ton monstrosities that sat on the top and on the bottom of the pit to protect the workers. So it was like building a sports car versus building a diesel truck. You know, both of them will travel. One of them requires a little less engineering because it just assumes that we're going to just pour a lot of material into it. Okay, so that was number one. Soviet reactors use graphite because it's cheaper to build, because it's cheaper to fuel, because it's faster to put into service. And the question becomes, why didn't we in the West use graphite? Why didn't we look at that and say, wait a minute, let's use a pencil? Well, why are we building the sports car when we could have the truck? Well, I said that there were two major differences between the West and the Soviet reactors. And the first was that they used graphite as a moderator instead of water. And the second, the more important one, is that they have a positive void coefficient. Now, the void coefficient describes what happens to the reactivity of a reactor when there are voids, which are normally steam bubbles. It gets hot enough so that the water vaporizes, and you get a pocket, just a little bubble of steam that, it does thing, and that's the void coefficient. What happens when you get those bubbles? Now, if you have a negative void coefficient, which is what Western reactors have, then if the reactor gets too hot, or if it loses pressurization in the primary loop, that's the heat exchanger that goes between the actual core and the steam generator, Then the coolant turns into vapor. You have a bunch of voids that get formed, and all the reactivity drops until you kill the reaction. No moderation means no chain reaction. It means that you're not slowing those neutrons down or bouncing them around inside the core. They just go straight out. So now you've killed the reaction. There is still decay heat, and it's still dangerous because even if you stop all the reaction, there's a lot of heat that needs to be removed from the core. If you want to see a practical example, you could look at Fukushima. Fukushima, that's exactly what happened. The reactions actually stopped when all the power to the plant got wiped out. But because they had no power to the plant and because the backup generators got wiped out by the tsunami, they couldn't run the pumps. And that decay heat over a matter of days just built and built and built. And with no cooling to pull that heat away from the core, eventually things failed and you had a hydrogen explosion. Now, the alternative is what the USSR had in its RBMK reactors. We have a negative void coefficient. The RBMK reactors have what's called a positive void coefficient. Now, remember, Western reactors used water as a moderator, so you need the moderator to slow down those neutrons enough to sustain the chain reaction. Take away the water, and the chain reaction stops. However, in an RBMK reactor, the graphite is the moderator. That means that if you take away the water, the chain reaction actually increases. The reactivity actually increases. Now, that's a nuclear double whammy. Not only have you lost your coolant, which you need to take a heat away from the core, remember Fukushima, that's the nuclear pile, but you've also increased the rate at which you get reactivity. You've increased it exponentially. But wait, that's not the end of the bad news. This is actually a triple whammy. You see, with a positive void coefficient, if the reactor runs away just a little, you get steam bubbles, voids. Those voids increase the reactivity, which increases the amount of heat, which increases the amount of steam bubbles, which increases the amount of heat. It's a positive feedback loop. Reaction leads to heat, heat leads to voids, voids leads to more reaction, which leads to more heat, which leads to even more voids, and so on. I like to compare it to, because I've done scuba diving, I love scuba diving. If you were at a certain depth and you fill up your buoyancy compensator and then you start to rise, the problem is, as you decrease the amount of water pressure, the air that you've put into your buoyancy compensator will expand. And as it expands, it becomes more buoyant. And as it becomes more buoyant, you start to rise faster. And as you start to rise faster, it becomes even larger, which makes you more buoyant, which makes you rise even larger. Again, that's the positive feedback loop. In other words, it starts to run away. Now, how fast it runaways depends on how big that positive void coefficient is. All right. So now we understand what's going on. We understand the two things that make the Chernobyl reactor different than a Western reactor. Let's talk about the actual accident. Now, if you watch the HBO special, which I would suggest you do, because it really is very well done. Not just the acting, which top notch, not just the writing, but they got the facts right. So it's stellar. Now, the plant workers were conducting a test of an emergency core cooling feature that would engage during a shutdown. Now, as I mentioned, even when a nuclear reactor is shut down, it requires cooling because of decay heat. The fuel rods are fantastically hot for days, even after the reaction has been stopped. In fact, the larger you make the reactor, the more decay heat you have. Look at the reactor on, say, a modern nuclear submarine, both the USSR and the US or Russia. In both of those, the reactors are so small, the nuclear piles are so minimal, that you could actually pull the plug on all the cooling. The reactor would shut down, you would lose all power in the sub, but nothing would happen. It wouldn't breach, it wouldn't get hot enough to actually melt through the containment. It would just stop because the decay heat is on the level of kilowatts. But in something like a nuclear power plant that's designed to serve a city or greater, the decay heat, it can be up in the megawatts. You need something to carry that heat away because it cannot just passively deal with that much energy. Now, also, reactors constantly create noble gases that poison the reactor. Now, usually this isn't a problem because of the heat of the reactor. It purges those gases as quickly as they can be created. But at low power levels, those gases build up. So keep that in mind because that's something that nuclear engineers need to know. How long has this reactor been running in a low power state or in a shutdown state? Because that will determine how many of those gases have built up in the core and how much time I have to give it to cycle those gases out. Now, the crew at Chernobyl were testing a theory, and it's a good theory. that they could have enough rotational energy from the steam turbine to generate the energy needed to tide over the cooling pumps during the 1 minute gap between losing power and the diesel generators kicking in. Essentially, they were using massive turbines as a flywheel, calculating that their sheer rotational energy would keep the coolant flowing until they could get the pumps running on the backup power source. Now, it was a good idea, and they drew it up with a series of parameters that the test needed to take place at. The first was that the reactor would have to be running at between 700 and 800 megawatts. The second was that the steam turbine would have to be at full speed at the start of the test because, again, you're assuming that it's spinning as fast as it possibly can so that you'll have all that energy to spin down and run the cooling pumps. And the third is that the reactor would be in a stable configuration at its power level, meaning that there must be a minimum of 26 control rods in the core at 700 to 800 megawatts. Now, in reality, the reactor was not running at 700 to 800 megawatts, but at 200 megawatts. And remember, I told you in low power states, especially in an RMBK reactor, it tends to build up those noble gases that poison the reaction. Number two, the steam turbine wasn't at full speed, but was actually at less than half of its rated rotational speed. And third, the reactor was incredibly unstable. Remember, there were supposed to be a minimum of 26 control rods in the core. They had taken out all but 6. So essentially, you've primed the reactor. It's ready to run away. Imagine how they've stacked the deck against themselves. 1, the positive void coefficient and the graphite moderator guarantees that if they lose control of the reactor even a little bit, it will not it will run away from them. They also know that because the reactor was running at just above shutdown levels, the core was absolutely riddled with pockets of noble gases that had not yet burned away. Now, those pockets were like lead weights holding down a hot air balloon, or like me underwater with a lead weight belt. They made me artificially think that I'm at the right level. They made the operators think that the reactor was running stable, but in reality, if you lose those weights, you're a runaway. Now, as the test calculations were done, assuming that the turbine had the energy it would have if it were at full speed, running the test when it was at half speed meant that it was guaranteed not to have enough energy to carry the cooling for the minute that it would take to get the backup pumps running. And of course, with all 6 rods withdrawn, there was virtually nothing holding back the reactor from disaster. In other words, this was a test that they should have known was going to go wrong. In fact, there was no chance for it to go right. Not only that, but these were experienced engineers and technicians who must have seen all the warning signs. All but 6 rods withdrawn and only 200 megawatts indicated. They had to know that there was xenon poisoning. That was the only explanation. That was the only thing that could keep the power levels so low when you've basically let the reactor loose. But they went through with the test. And if you watch the HBO movie, you understand why. So let's talk a little bit about that. At 12:34:04, that's 4 seconds a.m., they started the test. Now, they shut off all the pumps, and immediately steam bubbles began to form. Now, since it was a positive coefficient reactor, the steam bubbles increased the rate of reaction. The increased heat, in turn, increased the amount of steam, which increased the rate of reaction. Now, at 1:23 and 40 seconds, that's just 30 seconds after they started the test, somebody in the control room didn't like what they saw, and they hit the emergency shutdown or the scram button. Now, unfortunately, since they had removed most of the rods, even the manual fail-safe rods, the scram system only had control of 12, so they couldn't even get it to the minimum level of controlled stability. Now, those 7-meter rods would have taken 20 seconds to be fully inserted. Remember, it went from start to horrible in just 36 seconds. And unfortunately, the tips of those control rods were made of graphite. And as we know, graphite is the moderator, which means that if you add more graphite, you add more moderation. You actually increase the reactivity. That meant that the first few seconds of insertion actually increased the rate of reaction. And again, the positive void coefficient meant that it was running away faster and faster and faster. Now, by 1:23 and 43 seconds, this is just 3 seconds after the scram button was pressed, the power rose from 200 megawatts to 530 megawatts. Now, the amazing heat spike, it fractured the fuel rods in their fuel channels, making it impossible to continue inserting the control rods. Now, at 123.44, the power level rose to at least 33,000 megawatts. Honestly, we don't know how because the instruments all died. They lost power in the control room, and they were all pegged at full high. We know that the fuel disintegrated. We know that the steam burst through all of the pressure tubes in the plant. And again, this is 44 seconds after they started the test. Now, at that moment, there was a massive, massive explosion. The 1,000-ton lid on the top of the reactor was thrown into the air. The nuclear core, the actual fuel is exposed to open air, and the oxygen replaced the nitrogen that usually bathed the core. And because you've introduced oxygen into something that's incredibly hot, ridiculously hot, all of the graphite in the reactor caught fire. Now, immediately after the steam explosion, there was a second explosion. For many, many years, we assumed that the second explosion must have been the igniting of the release of hydrogen. And it makes sense. Hydrogen is flammable. You've introduced a lot of very hot oxygen, and you've given it a heat source. Of course it's going to explode. However, we're looking back at that now, and many now believe that the ratio of xenon radioisotopes released during the second explosion indicates that it was a nuclear power transient, which, yeah, that's as bad as it sounds. It wasn't an explosion of hydrogen. It was the result of the melting core material undergoing prompt criticality. And if prompt criticality sounds bad to you in terms of nuclear physics, it is. That's something you really don't want happening in an open pit. The explosion released 40 billion, with a B, joules of energy. That's the equivalent of 10 tons of TNT. Now, it wasn't just that that's a huge explosion. It's that explosion scattered all the material that was supposed to be forever entombed inside that core. That was the big problem. The explosion is bad. The fire is bad. But the fact that you've dispersed the core into the atmosphere, vaporized much of it, meant that it would do far more damage than if you had an accident that had rendered the plant unusable. Now, the HBO documentary does an incredible job, an excellent job at looking at the individuals involved in the accident. And I really don't want to get into that because I don't have to. There's plenty of teachable moments for geeks from Chernobyl just looking at the facts of the technology, looking at the facts of the logs, looking at the mistakes that they made. I think the first lesson has to be that, first, we normalize things. It's a human trait. When we deal with something on a regular basis, we tend to think that they'll always act in the way that we've seen them act. Slotkin from the Manhattan Project, he's actually a prime example. They were playing with half spheres of fissile material. They called it the demon core. And he was violating all of the lab practices and using a screwdriver to pry open the halves just to get them a little closer and a little farther so that they could do their criticality experiments. Well, of course, he, at one point, got distracted, lost the wedge, the spheres slammed together, and you had prompt criticality. And he died, and many other people in the room got sick. But he did that because even though he knew it was dangerous, even though he knew that it could kill him, even though he knew that this was the most dangerous thing that mankind had ever created, they had dealt with it on a daily basis. It was something that they thought they knew. And when we know something, when we think we know something, we normalize it. And that goes for everything. It could go for people who deal with wild animals, people who deal with traffic patterns, people who deal with driving, storm systems, even nuclear reactors can lull us into a sense of thinking that we know it won't go wrong because we've been there when it's gone right so many times. And I think that's a very important lesson for all engineers. The second thing is that just because we know how something works, that doesn't mean we know how to fix it once it deviates from our understanding. Now, of course, Chernobyl is an extreme example because I don't honestly think there was much that they could have done in the 44 seconds from them starting the test to having the explosion. However, it does mean that you have to build something into the system where your assumptions are always questioned. It has to be, because we have to account for, number one, we have to account for us not being able to react to something that goes beyond our experience. And if you don't build that into the institution, if you don't build that into the process, it means that you're building a weakness into the actual running of something. And if that something happens to be a nuclear power plant, that's deadly. Now, also, and I think this is a big one for me, there is so much instability in real life that you must absolutely, positively, must design systems like this to fail safe. In other words, they have to be able to survive operator incompetence or malfeasance. They have to be able to survive worst-case scenarios. And they must absolutely, positively be able to shut themselves down, not as an automated system, because an automated system could fail, but as a principle of physics. If you're going to build a nuclear reactor today, you have to be able to take away all the cooling in a tsunami, an earthquake, whatever it might be, and it must be able to shut itself down, not because the systems shut it down, but because the loss of all control means that it turns off. Now, luckily, we do have that. Luckily, we have designed that tech. Luckily, we have the knowledge to build those sorts of systems. And we're going to get to that right after we take a moment for the tech. Are you looking for a gaming keyboard experience? I'm Father Robert Ballecer, the Digital Jesuit, and it might just be at HyperX. Nestled into one of the suites in the Venetian is HyperX, and they have been redefining both the cost and the experience of true gaming pleasure for years. Now in front of me, I've got an example of one of their Origin series of keyboards. This is unique for many reasons, but the one that I really enjoy is the fact that they've made their own switches. Now, I know if you've been in the gaming keyboard game for a while, you understand that enterprise is kind of ruled by two companies. Well, HyperX said no more. They've developed their own line of linear and tactile keys, and I gotta say, at first touch, they feel really, really good. Now, of course, they're keyboards because they're gaming. They're fully illuminated, they're fully programmable, and it does include everything, including the number key for those who want the more expansive keyboard experience. The Origin line doesn't stop there. They've also got their tactile line of switches, which gives you a slightly different feel. What I like about this is HyperX is expanding what you can get from their single lineup. If you want more of a clicky feel, you can get that. If you want more of a tactile feel, you can get that. If you want to have it full illuminated, you can get that. You just choose what fits your gaming personality, and the rest is, well, up to them. Now, they've also got something for people who prefer a slightly smaller form factor. You can get this, which is their core, which does not have the number keypad, but it does fit into a much smaller compact package and does include all the same goodness that you expect from its larger cousins. Yes, you're going to get either the tactile, the linear keys. Yes, you are going to get the full illumination. And yes, you do get things like USB-C connectivity. Now, no matter what kind of keyboard you want from HyperX, you're going to be able to find it. And I think that just bodes well for their entire lineup. They get gamers. They get what we're looking for. They get the sort of premium feel and the premium construction that we're willing to pay for. And everything from the real aluminum chassis to the weighted keyboard to the fact that it doesn't feel like a chunk of plastic just bodes well for HyperX. I really love checking out the HyperX booth at CES just because they've got some of the coolest stuff. It's all blinky, it's all glowy. And not to say that that's always what I'm looking for, but I love the fact that they spend the time to actually ask their customers, what do you like? What is it that you want to see? What are the things that get you excited about our products? And that's what they've got with this. This is the HyperX Alloy Origins. And I got to say, I've had this thing for about 2 months now, and I love it. I didn't think it was for me. I'm not a big gaming keyboard person. I don't like spending $100 on a keyboard, but Oh my gosh, this has made me a convert. So you've got this milled aluminum body, and it's actually sizable. This thing weighs more than my laptop. You may not think that I would be excited by it weighing a lot, but there's something about having a nice solid base on which to type. It's a keyboard that doesn't flex, not even a little bit. You can type at this thing full speed, and it feels like a chunk of granite. Which is, by the way, that's a positive thing. You've also got this full 104 key keyboard, and these are using HyperX's own mechanical switches. I mentioned this in the CES video, and for the longest time, there was a monopoly on the switches. We all know that you had to get Cherry, and there was one other company that you could choose to get that feel, the long throw, the clickiness. But HyperX decided to make their own, and they've done a really good job. These aren't quite as clicky as I'd like them to be. They do actually have a version that's a bit clickier, but the trade-off is, of course, if you've got clicky, you better not have any neighbors because they are incredibly noisy. This is about as good as it's going to get while you're still, well, being polite to your neighbors. Now, yes, they do have all of the lights. I love the lights. The lights get me excited. However, it's not just about the lights. It's also about what you can do with the Ingenuity software. This doesn't just let you change the lighting patterns. It doesn't just let you illuminate, let's say, the keys that you need for a particular game. But I love the fact that I can do macro definition right here. All I have to do is hit a key, and it lets me say, okay, assign this to this, assign this to that. This is one of the things that I really like about gaming keyboards. Even if you don't use this for gaming, this is incredibly useful, like in the world of video editing. I have set this on my primary video editing station so that all of my often used functions are assigned to certain keys. And those are normally keys that I don't normally use otherwise. And I can switch back and forth just with the click of a button on my HyperX mouse. That's the other thing I really like about it. The fact that it's an entire ecosystem. You've got the mouse, you've got the keyboard, you've got the headset. They've tried to make this sort of the know-all, be-all for the gamer. If you like their gear, if you like it being solid, if you like the way that it looks and the way that it feels, then I guess, $100 all told is probably not a whole lot. So look for this in a further episode of the Digital Just Reviews. All I know is that it's got me excited. Oh, and by the way, it's got a USB-C connector, which makes it nice and simple for you to use this with your newer peripherals. All right, so I teased before the break about a different kind of reactor. I wanted you to think about what was possible. Remember, we want a reactor that will fail safe. We want a reactor that will shut itself down, not because of an automated system, but because of physics. We want a reactor that's safe and, yes, clean. Now, the question is, do those exist? Might those exist? Could they ever exist? And the answer is, not only could they exist, but they already do. We've already kind of built these things. See, not too long ago, there was a company called TerraPower that came up with their own Gen 4 reactor. Now, the most developed version is a sodium fast reactor, but all of them are very high temperature designs that lend themselves to the creation of hydrogen for next power systems. I could geek out over the tech, but the bottom line is that all of the competing designs for this Gen 4 reactor have one very important thing in common, and that is that they fail safe. All of them can be operating at full power, then lose all cooling, and they would just shut themselves down. Now, the one that I want to talk about is the traveling wave reactor. The traveling wave reactor has got me interested for a while because it's a fabulous piece of tech. Now, the most common type of nuclear reactor on the planet, as we talked about briefly during my segment on Chernobyl, is the light water reactor, the LWR. Now, LWRs use normal water as opposed to heavy water, both as a coolant and as that neutron moderator, and it has a negative void coefficient, which is safer, but not safe. Again, remember that fun fact about nuclear fission is that as you split a uranium of U-235, it releases energy, 2 lighter elements, and 3 free neutrons. These 3 free neutrons are what cause the chain reaction. So if I'm moderating it, I am sustaining the chain reaction. I take away the moderator, and that chain reaction goes away. Now, I want that sort of safety, but I also want the ability to completely ignore my reactor. Once the moderation has stopped, I want to be able to walk away from the reactor and just assume that it's going to freely shut itself down. As we saw with Fukushima, that's not the case. And that's why a Gen 4 reactor is important. If you boil away or remove the water, the neutrons aren't slowed, but you still get that decay heat. I need a reactor that can survive the decay heat. Now, when we're talking about a traveling wave reactor, a lot of people will wonder, well, exactly how is that different? What changes? What is the physics of a TWR that makes it so different from a light water reactor? Well, put quite simply, it's more like a natural process than it is something man-made. In a traveling wave reactor, you're going to have 4 zones, 4 areas that are using plutonium-239, which is a non-enriched version. So it's kind of like the RBMK reactor in that I can take fissile material out of the ground and dump it into this reactor. And after a short time, the reactor will actually create fuel. You'll have the depleted zone filled with fission products and leftover fuel. You have the fission zone, which is the active fission area within the fuel that was just bred by the previous zone. And then you have the breeding zone, which is free neutrons from the active fission that are turning that fertile fuel into fissile fuel. And then the fresh zone, which is sort of like the brand new, the fresh fuel. Now, imagine this pit where you just keep dumping material in, and what you get out is refined material. That's the wonderful thing. This actually burns junk fissile material and purifies it. And it gives you heat. It gives you enough power to create hydrogen. It gives you enough power to run a reactor. That's what's got me so excited about the Gen 4 reactors. Not necessarily just because they're safe, not necessarily just because they're incredibly efficient, but because they can actually take the waste products from the previous generations of reactors, all of those waste products that we have around the world, and it can reuse them as fuel. And that's amazing. Imagine if I told you that I could give you a car that would run on all the emissions that your car has emitted since you first started driving. That's essentially what we're trying to give people with a Generation 4 reactor. TWRs can burn for 40 plus years, and they're far more efficient than light water reactors because of a more complete burn. You don't get down to, as you do with an LWR, below that incredibly high purity, and then the reaction just stops. In fact, an LWR will just keep burning, and it will burn up that junk material and leave behind more pure material. Also, the burned out core can be melted back into fertile fuel without the enrichment process. You don't need those centrifuges. You basically just heat it up, mix in some fertile fuel, and drop it back into the reactor. You can do all of that on the same grounds as the plant. Imagine that. No moving back and forth casks of radioactive material. The same plant just gets an extra shipment of new material every couple of years. They melt the old core, drop in the new material, and drop it all back, and it never leaves the campus. Now, there's also a huge amount of fertile material in the United States. It's about 700,000 metric tons of depleted uranium-238. That's mostly waste from years of enrichment. Again, remember that I told you about that enrichment process, which we use in the West. It gives us a much more enriched material, but it also leaves a lot of waste. Imagine if we could take that waste and use it as fuel. Now, if you were to stack all the waste in a solid block, it would fill a football field to a depth of about 30 meters. Now, even taking conservative estimates of how much power that stockpile could generate, if we had Generation 4 reactors, it could sustain 80% of the world's energy consumption, even assuming the average usage is the U.S. usage. Imagine that. Now, comparatively, nuclear waste is a tiny amount of waste compared to the waste created by coal and oil. I don't want people to go off from the show and think, well, nuclear is no good. Nuclear caused Chernobyl. Nuclear caused so much waste. Actually, if you really compared risk and you really compare the amount of lives lost, we lose far more people to poor air quality and poor water quality than we have to radioactive accidents. France is a great example of the proper running of a nuclear system. 80% of France's power comes from nuclear. They have the cheapest energy in Europe. They generate less carbon dioxide than Denmark. They have 5 tons of carbon dioxide per year per capita, which is amazingly low. I mean, even the Germans generate 10 tons per year. Now, the U.S. bought 1,600 nuclear warheads from Russia and Ukraine and turned them into fuel for nuclear reactors. Imagine if we could do that with everything. Not just nuclear warheads, but all of the junk stockpiles, all the stuff that we've buried, all of the fuel rods that we still have sitting in those temporary pools that have been there for 50 years. We could turn that into clean burning energy. And we could use it inside of reactors that cannot melt down, that do not have the ability to become a Chernobyl or even a Fukushima, that could be run by complete idiots, and they could still not cause an accident because the physics of the system is just so much better. Now, I'm sure there's going to be people out there who are saying, well, if this is true, if we could do this, why didn't we do it all the way in the back? Well, there's a dirty secret to the nuclear industry across the world, not just in the United States, but in Russia as well. And that is the early efforts of our nuclear industry were actually really focused on weapons. We wanted processes. We wanted an industry that could enrich so that we could use for weapons. And so we built the plants to sort of take advantage of that. We're not doing that anymore. Now we can look at plants, building them to generate power, specifically to generate power. And if we did that, that's when we would build a Gen 4. And that's what's got me excited. Because now that we are looking at some more sustainable energy, now that, fossil fuels just don't look that appealing. I mean, in the United States, until just recently, fossil fuels became more expensive than alternative energy. And that was with a huge subsidy for fossil fuels. Now, if we put the same sort of energy into safe nuclear, into Gen 4 reactors, into recycling the garbage that we've already created, combined with other renewable energy sources, we have a power source that could exponentially grow along with our demand. And for me, that's just amazing. Well, folks, I'm afraid that we've reached that time. That's right. I love spending time with you every week that we get together here. It lets me sort of, practice what I preach, to geek out with the people on the internet across the world. And it honestly gives me a way to get away from all of the work that I'm doing here in the Vatican. Geeking out is my first love, and I'm just glad that you could join me. Now, please, if you've got the chance, check out my YouTube page at youtube.com/thedigitaljesuit, or just Digital Jesuit. There you can subscribe. Please please pass it on to your friends so that they can subscribe and pass it on to their friends. And also don't forget that you can find me on Twitter, twitter.com/PadreSJ. There you'll be able to find me, what I'm doing, and perhaps even suggest guests for future shows. That's right, I've actually got the ability to bring guests in now. I just tested that out the other week, and I'm looking forward to it. And finally, I do want to remind people that I've got a Patreon. I am not enabling it yet, but it's patreon.com/PadreSJ. I'll be opening it up soon so that people can, if they like, show some love. I'd like to grow the show. I'd like to grow my capabilities here. I'd like to expand the reach of my network and really show my superiors that this is something special. Until then, I'm Father Robert Ballecer, the Digital Jesuit. Now get back in the corner.